Jonathan Isaac, stand tall for freedom of choice.
Are you familiar with an Israeli study that had 2.5 million patients and found that the vaccinated group was actually 7 times more likely to get infected with COVID than the people who had gotten COVID naturally?
Senator, I'd have to get back to you on that one. I'm not familiar with that study.
Well, you think you might want to be if you're going to travel the country insulting the millions of Americans, including NBA star Jonathan Isaac, who have had COVID, recovered, look at a study with 2.5 million people and say, well, you know what? It looks like my immunity is as good as a vaccine or not. And in a free country, maybe I ought to be able to make that decision. Instead, you've chosen to travel the country calling people like Jonathan Isaac and others, myself included, flat earthers. We find that very insulting, goes against the science. Are you a doctor or a medical doctor?
I've worked over 30 years on health policy.
You're not a medical doctor. Do you have a science degree? And yet you travel the country calling people flat earthers who have had COVID, looked at studies of millions of people, and made their own personal decision that their immunity they naturally acquired is sufficient. But you presume somehow to tell over 100 million Americans who have survived COVID that we have no right to determine our own medical care. You alone are on high, and you've made these decisions, a lawyer with no scientific background, no medical degree. This is an arrogance coupled with an authoritarianism that is unseemly and un-American. You, sir, are the one ignoring the science. The vast preponderance of scientific studies, dozens and dozens, show robust, long-lasting immunity after COVID infection. Even the CDC does not recommend measles vaccine if you have measles immunity. The same was true for smallpox. But you ignore history and science to shame the flat earthers, as you call them. You should be ashamed of yourself and apologize to the American people for being dishonest about naturally acquired immunity. You want more people to choose vaccination? So do I. You want to lessen vaccine hesitancy? So do I. You want to have that happen? Quit lying to people about naturally acquired immunity. Quit lording it over people, acting as if these people are deplorable and unwashed. Try persuasion instead of government cudgels. Try humility instead of arrogance. Try freedom instead of coercion. But most of all, try understanding that there's no more basic medical right than deciding what we inject into our bodies. Today, after hearing that millions of people in a study show without a doubt that there's a great deal of immunity from getting it naturally, do you want to apologize to the 100 million Americans who suffered through COVID, survived, have immunity, and yet you want to hold them down and vaccinate them? Do you want to apologize for calling those people flat earthers?
Senator, I appreciate your question and appreciate that everyone has their opinion. We follow the facts and the science at HHS. We use the expertise of the medical professionals, the scientists at HHS to make decisions. It's a team effort, and we rely on what is on the ground showing us results.
Except for the dozens and dozens of studies. In fact, most, if not all of the studies show robust immunity from getting the disease naturally. The CDC says if you've had measles and have immunity, you don't have to be vaccinated. The same was true of smallpox. You're selectively doing this because you want us to submit to your will. You have no scientific background, no scientific degrees, and yet you aren't really concerned about 100 million Americans who had the disease. You just want to tell us, do as you're told. That's what you're telling us. You want to mandate this on all of us. You're going to tell us if I have 100 employees, you're going to put me out of business with a $700,000 fine if I don't obey what you think is a science. Don't you understand that it's presumptuous for you to be in charge of all the science? Have you ever heard of a second opinion? I can't go to my doctor and ask my doctor's opinion. I mean, this is incredibly arrogant, combined with this authoritarian nature that you think, well, we'll just tell all of America to do what I say, and they better, or we'll fine them, or put them in jail, or not let them go to school, or not let them travel. The science is against you on this. The science is clear. Naturally acquired immunity is as good as a vaccine. The Israel study actually showing it better. This isn't an argument against the vaccine, but it's an argument for letting people make a decision who already have immunity. You're not willing to consider natural immunity?
Senator, our team has reviewed every study that's out there on COVID, whether it's from Israel, from the US, or wherever else. They have used the facts that have been provided through the rigorous research that's been done to reach a conclusion. 660,000 Americans and more have died because of COVID. We're trying to do everything we can to save as many as possible. We're using the facts, we're following the science and following the law.
Nobody's arguing the severity of this, but you are completely ignoring the science on natural immunity. So's Fauci, so's the whole group. You're just ignoring it because you want submission. You want everybody just to submit to your will, do as you're told, despite the evidence, the large body of scientific evidence that says naturally acquired immunity does work, is an important part of how we're all going to recover from this. So's the vaccine. But when you add them together, we're at a much different place than if you ignore them. 100 million Americans, by conservative CDC estimates, have had the disease. 200 million or more now have been vaccinated. It's a good thing. Combined together, it's how the disease is. Nobody wants to get the disease. We're not advising anybody to get the disease. But if you're unlucky enough to get it, think of the nurses and doctors and orderlies who all bravely took care of COVID patients. There was no vaccine for a year and a half. They took care of people, risked their lives. They got it, survived, and now people like you are arrogant enough to say you can no longer work in the hospital because you've already had the disease. We're going to force you to take a vaccine that the science does not prove is better than naturally acquired. That's an arrogance that should be chastened.
Thank you.
From Israel, 700,000 individuals were studied very carefully, and it showed that natural immunity was about 13 times more protective against getting the infection. It was also more protective against hospitalizations, which is really what we're interested in. And now, it also showed that those who had natural immunity and went out and got a single dose of the vaccine got a little slight increase in their immune protection, but it did sort of answer this question and made it a settled science. Natural immunity is real, it's durable, and it's going strong. And when we require those with natural immunity to get the vaccine, we really didn't have science behind it. It was a hypothesis that our public health leaders had, that it would drop off a cliff and it would be fleeting. It turns out that was a bad hypothesis. It was wrong. And as a result, tens of thousands of Americans died over the spring because we rationed our vaccine supply accordingly. We should have had those with natural immunity step aside as we get more vulnerable people vaccinated.
So are you saying that if you are a corporation now that is mandating vaccines for people, whether or not they've had COVID before or not, that might be overkill? That in fact, if you have had COVID, you probably do not need a vaccine?
That's exactly right. So if a corporation or a university is truly following the science, they would do what we do in science and evolve our strategy as the data come in. This data is overwhelming. It's conclusive. It's a large, sophisticated study, and it clearly shows that those with natural immunity do not have to get a vaccine. They may benefit slightly from one additional dose, but it should not be a requirement for those already immune. By the way, those with chickenpox are told by the CDC, if you had it in the past, you should not get the chickenpox or varicella vaccine. It's the same immune system. It should be the same guidance.
And joining us now, Dr. Ben Carson, former Secretary of Housing and Urban Development and author of the new kids book, Why America Matters. Dr. Carson, welcome. Congratulations on your new book. We do want to talk to you about that. But first, let's talk about mandates. You were on the record saying that vaccines are good, mandates are not, adding that mandates open the door to dangerous precedents. Explain what you mean by that.
Came to America from all over the world is because this was a place that had freedom, had liberty, and those liberties are given to us not by the government, but by God. The right to lead our lives as we should without interfering with anyone else. Now, when we start opening ourselves to government officials saying, you must do this, you can't do this, you must say this, you can't say that, we really are starting to fundamentally change the foundation of our nation. And we have to be very much aware that that is a big issue. You couple that with the fact that you're trying to mandate something that hasn't been fully proven. We don't know what the long-term impact of this vaccine is, particularly when you're dealing with children. We do know that when you're dealing with children, you don't have a high risk from the virus itself, but we don't know what the long-term risk of the vaccines are. So we need to be a little more careful, I think.
Dr. Carson, there is debate, as we just heard in Heather's reporting, about the potential harm of claiming a religious exemption for masks or vaccines, watering down other religious claims, and that debate even happening among pastors. As we just heard the experts say, religious exemptions are meant to be a remedy, not for objecting just to bad policy. Dr. Carson, do you see a case for religious exemptions, particularly for masks? And if so, how would you defend that from that standpoint?
Well, you know, as far as vaccine is concerned, you know, some of the laboratory work is done with fetal cells, and that's a legitimate concern for some people, so I understand that. You know, as far as the masks are concerned, I'm not exactly sure what the religious implications are there, but there are some good developmental arguments there. Children, for instance, need to learn how to correlate the facial expression with what's being said. That's a very important part of sociological development. And if we deprive them of that, we don't know what the long-term effects of that are, but they can't possibly be good.
A $100 savings bond in West Virginia, a $10,000 scholarship in Lancaster, California, free beer in New Jersey, donuts from Krispy Kreme, Shake Shack fries in New York City.
You just think of this when you think of vaccination.
And a drink in Connecticut. In a push to encourage Americans to get their vaccine, governments and businesses across the country are thinking outside the box. Recently, Ohio Governor Mike DeWine capturing much national attention. For Ohio residents who get their shots, the state is offering something in return, a shot at winning $1 million.
And the winner each Wednesday will receive $1 million.
And so far, state officials say the lottery has been a huge success.
This has been very successful. This past Friday was our highest vaccine administration day in 3 weeks. We were experiencing a 24% decrease week over week for those prior 2 Fridays. Last Friday, that age group saw a 6% increase.
Since DeWine's announcement, several governors following suit. To encourage residents to get the vaccine, Maryland Governor Larry Hogan also announcing a lottery with one grand winner to take home $40,000.
You guys weren't expecting that one.
In this year's annual letter, Melinda and I take the toughest questions we get asked and give our answers. One that's come up for a long time is, as we make the world healthier, is the population going to get so big that feeding everybody and maintaining the environment is going to be impossible? Here we can see a chart that looks at the total world population over the last several hundred years. And at first glance, this is a bit scary. We go from less than 1 billion in 1800, and then 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7.4 billion where we are today is happening even faster. So Melinda and I wondered whether providing new medicines and keeping children alive, would that create more of a population problem? What we found out is that as health improves, families choose to have less children. And this effect is very, very dramatic. We find that in every country of the world, this is repeated. The population growth goes down as we improve health. So we've taken that chart that shows the global population growth, and we've actually extended it out all the way to 2100. And we can see that instead of continuing, it actually flattens out. Another way to see that is through this rate of population growth. And you can see that in the 60s, that reached a pretty high number, over 2% per year, and it's now come way, way down. Now, 11 billion people, still a lot, but the good news is that the faster we improve health, the faster family size goes down, and so we can feel great about saving those lives.
In a brotherly spirit, I join in this message of hope
for a brighter future. Thanks to God and to the work of many, we now have vaccines to protect us from COVID-19. They grant us the hope of ending the pandemic, but only if they are available to all and if we work together. Being vaccinated with vaccines authorized by the competent authorities is an act of love, and contributing to ensure the majority of people are vaccinated is an act of love. Vaccination is a simple but profound way of promoting the common good and caring for each other, especially the most vulnerable. I pray to God that everyone may contribute their own small grain of sand, their own small gesture of love. No matter how small, love is always great. Contribute with these small gestures for a better future. God bless you and thank you.
Romanism is now regarded by Protestants with far greater favor than in former years. In those countries where Catholicism is not in the ascendancy, and the papists are taking a conciliatory course in order to gain influence, there is an increasing indifference concerning the doctrines that separate the Reformed churches from the papal hierarchy. The opinion is gaining ground that, after all, we do not differ so widely upon vital points as has been supposed, and that a little concession on our part will bring us into a better understanding with Rome. The time was when Protestants placed a high value upon the liberty of conscience which had been so dearly purchased. They taught their children to abhor popery and held that to seek harmony with Rome would be disloyalty to God. But how widely different are the sentiments now expressed.
The coronavirus taking quite a toll on the Amish community in Lancaster County last spring. And according to a medical center at the heart of it all, because of that, the Amish have achieved what no other community has been able to do: herd immunity. So Alex George, fill us in.
So, Dawn, that medical center says that when churches were allowed to reopen in 2020, the Amish community came together in Lancaster County, and that's when 90% of the households of the Plain community had one member at least contract COVID-19, giving them now, this medical center says, herd immunity.
Herd immunity refers to the number of people in a community or a country, for that matter, that have some protection against an infectious process.
The Plain community of Amish and Mennonites in Lancaster County is making headlines for possibly having herd immunity. A medical center in the New Holland borough says after 90% of households were infected in 2020, this year the families are immune.
We don't really know how long you're protected. And we've seen cases where people get reinfected. So I don't personally believe that we will reach herd immunity going forward without the use of vaccination.
But experts are debating whether this is really as good as it sounds, especially since new COVID variants pose a threat. They say trying to get this type of herd immunity can actually have the opposite effect.
The idea that, we'll just let it happen naturally, in my opinion, is a bad idea. We need to vaccinate to prevent severe illness and death.
Dr. Mike says whether this community actually has herd immunity should not make anyone else think it's feasible for their households too.
I don't want people to get a false sense of security. Well, the Amish community in Lancaster County was the first in the country to reach herd immunity, and we can let our guard down. We cannot.
We reached out to Lancaster County as well as that medical bureau in New Holland, and we also reached out to numerous professors of Amish communities and Amish culture to find out a little bit more about this, and we did not hear back tonight, Dawn.
All right, Alex George live for us. Thank you, Alex.
There was recognition that this new data coming out of Israel, as I recall, demonstrated that the term that's often used is natural immunity. It's an odd term. but it's now in common language. And what that means is protection afforded by having been infected and recovered from infection, which will generate a broad immune response. And it's now been shown in that paper and others that the breadth of that immune response in terms of T and B cell memory populations is more diverse and more long-lasting than the breadth of immune response elicited by the spike-based vaccines alone. And then those data showed that you're alluding to is that this natural immunity is not only broader and more durable, which contradicted some studies that the CDC had developed. So we were in kind of tension, which is the real data, the CDC data, or these other papers that evaluated memory T and B populations. Which is true. We have multiple truths or multiple pieces of data and different groups claiming one way or the other. And then this data dropped about the evidence of protection. And it seems to indicate, consistent with the claims that the breadth and durability of the immune response was superior with the natural infection and recovery. There's also evidence that there's a significant, depending on the time frame, 6 to 20-fold improvement in protection from infection and disease associated with the natural immunity acquired from prior infection compared to that conferred by the vaccine. So now the public, in their social contract with the public health agencies, is faced with the situation where they had been told that natural immunity was not as protective, that they can't rely on that if you've been previously infected, you should still get both doses of vaccine, that this vaccination would provide broad, durable protection. It would protect you and it would protect your elders from you potentially spreading disease to them. Now those things have all come into question. And I think the population is still reeling from that. I think that we have kind of dug into these camps. My sense is that people haven't really fully processed what this means. It is profound. Now, we were discussing before we started shooting that I had a long podcast interview today and kind of advisory with a group of Latin American physicians and scientists that were evaluating public policy for vaccine rollout versus early treatment options, et cetera, for the different cohorts that they have to protect. And they were expressing, kind of seeing this data from the eyes of folks that haven't really had good access to vaccine, but are facing the prospects that their countries could execute vaccine contracts and bring these vaccines in, and asking the question, does this make sense for us? Is this good policy? Should our country invest in these RNA vaccines specifically, is why they were talking to me. And what are we going to get for it if we do this? What's going to be the benefit of our population? And it was a very level-headed discussion, but they were pushing me, getting back to this theme of I'm the vaccine skeptic. They were the ones pushing me saying, we just don't see the value here for our populations. We don't see a compelling case when these products aren't stopping the spread, and they are going to have to be re-administered fairly frequently if they're to be effective. So vaccination post-infection. Remember, this was the policy that those like me that have been infected should go ahead and take 2 jabs, take 2 doses of vaccine.
Which you did.
Which I did.
Yeah.
Hoping that it would be helpful for long COVID. That data hasn't really played out that way. And there's a paper showing that you can actually quench T-cell responses. You get an improved kind of a super immune response in that manuscript, they assert, after a single dose when you've been previously infected. But with the second dose, your T-cell population actually gets quenched, which is consistent with high zone tolerance. So if that paper was to be expanded and verified with more robust numbers, it would suggest that one dose after natural infection would be a good thing. 2 doses would be a bad thing. Now that's kind of the equivalent of 3 doses. If you think about it, natural infection being dose number 1. So to say that we don't have any data, I think is a little misleading. We have some leading indicators that suggest that it might not be such a good idea.
Explanation for why the numbers on Israel continue to look worse. They're now at the highest level of cases that they have ever been in any surge for a population that's 80% vaccinated and has administered the most booster shots. How do you explain that? And what can we learn from that so we don't follow that path as we have been following in this trajectory of the disease?
When you have such a fully vaccinated portion of your population, you will get breakthrough infections because of the reason I just mentioned. The vaccines are not 100%.
We're now hearing a lot about the pandemic of the unvaccinated. Now, in today's video, what we're going to do is take a very critical review of that statement and talk about the other characteristics that are common to hospitalized or people that have severe COVID or even die. And vaccination status actually doesn't come first to mind. As you can see in some of these images that I recently grabbed from major media outlets like WebMD, like CNN, and local news outlet, Como 4 News or something like that, somewhere in Orlando. There was another news outlet, MSNBC. So I've captured some screenshots of images of perfectly healthy people, according to WebMD and CNN and local media outlets. Now, when you see these images, they have common features. And those common features to some pundits in the media and politicians are they're unvaccinated. But to the average person, there's different features that are actually really telling by these pictures. And that's the fact that these individuals are clearly metabolically sick. Now, in this video is not to fat shame, and we're not going to fat shame people in this podcast and talk about, oh my gosh, they deserve to die, they deserve to get really sick. What we're going to focus in on is solutions above and beyond what we've been hearing about from the experts and the media and the pundits and the gurus and the public health officials. We haven't yet heard anything about weight loss. We haven't, although Dr. Fauci did mention that in 2019. I'll play that clip so you can hear that.
Prevent getting an infectious disease and having to have you as my doctor is what? Wearing a mask?
No.
You do that? I can see they're getting ready to sneeze or cough, walk away.
You avoid all the paranoid aspects and do something positive. A, good diet. B, you don't smoke, I know. I know you don't drink, at least not very much, so that's pretty good. Get some exercise. I know that you don't get as much exercise as you should.
That's correct.
Get good sleep. I think that the normal, low-tech, healthy things are the best thing that you can do, David, is stay healthy.
All right, well, I'm going to try to do that, and hopefully when I next see you, I will be even healthier than I am today.
I would imagine you would be, and I look forward to that.
Thank you very much.
Now, isn't that clip interesting? I honestly believe if Dr. Anthony Fauci would have said that in March of 2020, this whole pandemic would be over. People would be more healthy. The children would have gained the weight. They would not have gained the weight that they've gained. Your aunt, your uncle, your friends, and all the people in your life who have become more unhealthy as a direct result of our own policies would not be as unhealthy as they are now. We've made people more unhealthy. The data is here in children, in adults, and so forth. And we now know, here's a research article here in Nature Reviews Endocrinology last September. Will the COVID-19 pandemic worsen the obesity epidemic? The answer is yes, unequivocally yes at this point. And other articles go on to say, the obesity paradox predicts a second wave of COVID-19 to be severe in Western countries. Now I think we're on the third or fourth. I don't even know what wave. I think it's the third wave. Now, we've ignored the fact that our stay-home orders, closing gyms, closing schools while keeping fast food restaurants open, canceling sports, and closing parks. We've ignored the fact that our own interventions may have had unintended harms, and those unintended harms may have made people more vulnerable. And we're continuing to ignore this. While politicians and so forth are creating mandates, businesses are being forced to immunize individuals, even if individuals like myself are at very low risk for COVID, or even if individuals like you have already had COVID and you have natural immunity and you're at not increased risk for dying or being hospitalized. Your employer is now forcing you to get immunized. Well, is your employer removing the vending machines? Is your employer no longer going to serve Coca-Cola?
They are escorting me out of the building. What's your title, sir?
Don't come near me.
What's your title?
Don't come near me.
Okay.
Keep walking.
And this is what happens when you stand up for freedom and when you show up to work, willing to work, despite being unvaccinated. And this is the price you have to pay sometimes. But what they don't realize is that I'm willing to go lose everything. Job, paycheck, freedom, even my life for this cause. Be well. United we stand. Divided we fall.
There's nothing quite as eloquent as faith in the flames. Wouldn't you like to have a faith like that? A totally committed faith? A faith that will stand tall when the times get tough? Well, it's available to each of us. God wants to develop this strong faith within you. Faith developed as we make Jesus and His Word the center of our lives is a faith that will stand the test of the end times. If you spend time with God, quality time communicating with Him, a committed faith will result. If you spend time looking at Jesus as your Savior and Lord, an unyielding faith will result. Let's decide ahead of time that we'll develop a relationship with God based on a real trust, a trust that He knows best, a trust that He'll see us through the end times. It's really rather simple. The 3 Hebrews didn't bow down to that golden image because they were already bowing to someone else.